Hi, I'm Larry Jordan, and I'm going to share with you today some information about Marilyn Monroe that you don't know. It's contained in my new 768-page book called The Real Marilyn Monroe. I am a longtime investigative journalist, magazine publisher, weekly radio show producer, and award-winning author. And I got tired of seeing all these books by hack writers telling the same old stories over and over again about Maryland that frankly lacked credibility. So I decided to do my own book. It's taken about 5 or 6 years to do it, hundreds of interviews. I've been able to subsume things that nobody has previously reported about Maryland. One of the ways I've done that, incidentally, by way of explanation, is that in recent years, millions of newspaper pages have been digitized for the first time, dating all the way back to the 1800s. So you can type in on newspaper sites information that you're seeking, the name of an individual, what their activities were for a particular time period. And I was able to go back and canvass Marilyn's entire life and dig up a multitude of references about her and her activities. As a result, I have contemporaneous reporting about what she was up to, what she was saying to people, just a whole series of things that just have never appeared in any other book. So that's one of the ways I was able to obtain new information. There's also been a lot of declassified material on Maryland that's been released that for some curious reason has been just disregarded or otherwise overlooked by various authors and other documentarians. So that's included in the book. And Marilyn's personal papers have been released in recent years. So you can also glean a lot of information from that. Today, I wanted to start out by sharing something that I know you don't know. And that is that Marilyn Monroe had a way to get in touch with Bobby Kennedy without going through the Department of Justice switchboard. Now, there are these people that have examined some of Marilyn's phone records, phone bills, not all of which have been released, by the way. And they have seen, for example, that in the summer of 1962, she made several phone calls that lasted only a minute in duration. So they illogically conclude from that that Bobby never talked to Marilyn. However, Angie Novello, who was Kennedy's private secretary, confirmed that Bobby was always good about returning Marilyn's phone calls. So these people that speculate on how many times Marilyn was in touch with either of the Kennedy brothers are really missing the whole point. Obviously, if Robert Kennedy or anybody else called Marilyn, it would not be reflected on her phone bill unless they called collect, which is something that Bobby surely would not have done. Now, Joe DiMaggio Jr. did that on the early evening of August 4th, 1962, shortly before Marilyn died, and he reported she was in fine spirits. He detected nothing wrong. So the phone records are not the only evidence that we have to work with. What I discovered, and no other author has ever reported this, is that a person who is a collector of Maryland memorabilia acquired a book that had belonged to Marilyn, and inside the front cover of the book was taped a piece of paper just on the front of the page that's inside the cover. But the piece of paper was blank, which was a curious thing. So one day this individual got curious and he decided to peel the tape off of all four edges of the piece of paper. And he flipped the paper over, and to his surprise, he saw BK and a phone number listed. So he contacted me and asked me if I had any idea at all what that phone number represented or who it belonged to. As a matter of fact, I did. It was the unlisted telephone number of Robert Kennedy's private home, Hickory Hill, in McLean, Virginia. Now consider that Marilyn had hidden this in the front of a book, an important book in her collection. Obviously, the reason she did that is she did not want anybody who was in her home, any visitor or the household staff, anybody else, to ever see that number. So she hid it by taping it in reverse in the inside of the book. So what does that tell you? It tells you that Marilyn had a direct way to get in touch with Bobby Kennedy without calling DOJ. Now, you might ask, is it logical that Marilyn would have called Bobby Kennedy at home? And the answer is an emphatic yes. The reason is that even Jackie Kennedy would invite people that she knew her husband was sleeping with to various White House functions. Similarly, Ethel Kennedy would go with her husband to various parties. He would on occasion disappear into an adjacent room, lock the door, and entertain some young woman, after which he would return to the party and no questions were asked and there was no embarrassment and life went on. So this is kind of the attitude of the Kennedy women. So yes, it's entirely plausible that Marilyn, when she wanted to, could call and did call Bobby Kennedy at home. So that's one fact that really pulls the rug out from underneath all these other people that are thinking that they can quantify exactly how many times Marilyn was in touch with the Kennedys. There's another interesting aspect that I'm going to go into regarding all this. I also reveal that several members, I believe it's at least 3 members of the 20th Century Fox Board of Directors were Kennedy family cronies. Now, this puts a new spin on things. What these guys really were, none of them were qualified to be even involved in the movie industry, but what they were doing is they were raiding 20th Century Fox. They were trying to bankrupt the studio so that the studio would be forced to sell the land underneath the studio. In fact, some of that started to happen as Marilyn was trying to get her last movie underway in '62. A lot of the sound stages were not only shut down, the back lots were disassembled by bulldozers. The studio was in such great financial straits that they were not even watering the lawn, and they weren't even providing food in the commissary. So this is the dire state of the 20th Century Fox studios. But all of that was basically precipitated by this board of directors. Now you might ask, what was the whole point? I mean, the ground underneath the studio was of more value from the standpoint of real estate than what the studio was worth. Now, guess who would have benefited by the sale of that real estate? Some of it was acquired by Alcoa Aluminum. And who is it that had a direct connection to that big corporate entity? It was Ethel Kennedy, whose family, Skakel, I may not be pronouncing that correctly, Skakel, that family was involved with its company and Alcoa Aluminum. So all the while that Marilyn was conferring with Bobby Kennedy, beseeching him to help her in her contract dispute with 20th Century Fox, the Kennedy family had direct control over key members of the 20th Century Fox board, and yet they really weren't helping Marilyn. In fact, that board fired Marilyn initially. She only got rehired when Daryl Zanuck, who was overseas filming The Longest Day, became worried about the fate of the company that he co-founded. So he was able to stage a takeover with the help of another person, another shareholder, and return to the helm of 20th Century Fox. I also report exclusively that after Marilyn had been discharged by 20th Century Fox, she flew to New York quickly to confer surreptitiously with Daryl Zanuck, who made a private trip to that city to also confer with another shareholder and line up the stock takeover. And the evidence for this is there was a brief, obscure mention in a column that Zanuck had quietly come into New York and then left again, and it coincides with Marilyn's trip there. So she obviously did talk to Zanuck, and he assured her she would be rehired. And shortly thereafter, an executive of Fox was starting to show up at Marilyn's house for various meetings. And she went over revised scripts and so forth. So she was being rehired. There is no doubt about that. Another exclusive, completely off the topic we're talking about right now, is that I have a very detailed and compelling account of MARILYN's trip to Korea in 1954. As you will recall, she and Joe DiMaggio had gotten married, and after a brief honeymoon, they headed first to Japan, where he was booked to be part of a baseball exhibition or training camp there. Baseball is still very, very big in Japan. Well, that left MARILYN with absolutely nothing to do. It has been portrayed that it was just a spur of the moment invitation from a military man aboard an aircraft who approached MARILYN and said, "Hey, why don't you come to Korea and entertain the troops?" But that's not true. Actually, she had been talking about entertaining the troops, was quoted by various columnists over the previous several months. So this was an idea in the back of her mind. In fact, Cary Grant, I reveal, had written her a letter when he got wind of the fact that MARILYN might be making a trip to Korea. He and his wife had just been there. He reported how much his visit had boosted the morale of U.S. troops over there. So he was encouraging MARILYN to make that trip. And ultimately, the Japan trip presented that opportunity. So I have a very detailed day-by-day account, primarily from the piano player who was associated with the band that accompanied MARILYN. Now, the thing that's so striking and so interesting about this is MARILYN knew these men in the service who were still on the front lines. There still was never really an official truce called between North Korea and South Korea, by the way, even to this day. But she knew that these men would want to get a look at her. So she couldn't appear on stage, outdoor stages, all bundled up. So believe it or not, she braved the frigid cold, and she wore, and you've seen pictures of this, a spaghetti strap gown, sequin gown with her high heels, and that's it, no coat on stage as she was singing and entertaining the troops, while they in turn were all bundled up with their parkas and their hoods and their gloves and their heavy overcoats and sitting on the cold. And here she was exposed to the elements. On one occasion, it even started to sleet and snow while she was on stage. The piano player that I quote in the book recounts how his hands were so frozen that he could barely tap the keys of the piano keyboard. He had to keep his gloves on until just before it was time for him to accompany MARILYN. So this is a very interesting story. She ended up getting sick on this trip at the end of it, and on the long trip back to California and San Francisco, where she stayed with Joe's family and recuperated, she wasn't feeling well toward the end of it, but she really said that that was a highlight of her life, and she never really felt like a star until she had all these men over a period of days cheering her on. So this is an incredible, blessed event in the annals of MARILYN's life. I also had other revelations pertaining to some of the events surrounding MARILYN's death. For example, I reported that William Parker, who was the police chief in Los Angeles, got his job through blackmail. He had found evidence that the publisher of the Los Angeles Times was having an affair. So he had a couple of guys from the goon squad of the Los Angeles Police Department surreptitiously surveil this publisher, Mr. Chandler was his name, and come up with the goods on his extramarital affair. And they confronted Chandler, Parker did, with the evidence and threatened to go public with it if he didn't editorially change his position and back William Parker as the police chief of Los Angeles. So this is the type of guy with low ethical standards that was in charge of Marilyn Monroe's investigation. Bobby Kennedy was a close friend of William Parker. He stayed with Parker during the 1960 convention. He declared that William Parker was the best police chief in America, and Parker and J. Edgar Hoover had an ongoing feud. I scrutinized FBI files that confirmed that fact. Hoover had no use for this guy at all, was very suspicious of him. And the Kennedys had promised that Parker was going to have Hoover's job. So when Bobby got into some trouble over the weekend of August 4th and 5th, 1962, after visiting Marilyn's home twice, he was able to pit one man against the other, as both Hoover and Parker were competing to accommodate the Attorney General. Now, tellingly, on Monday, August 6th, Bobby Kennedy ad-libbed remarks when he was making a speech in San Francisco, and he lavishly praised Hoover and said he hoped that he would remain FBI director for as long as he lived. Now, this completely shocked his colleagues at the Department of Justice. And you can contrast his public remarks made in the wake of Marilyn's death with an oral history that I also scrutinized, in which Bobby Kennedy accused Hoover in a tape of being a blackmailer and being mentally unstable. So why was the Attorney General on Monday, August 6, 1962, praising Hoover when he actually privately felt that way about it? Another thing that I accomplished in doing my research on the book, and I know I'm jumping around, but I just want to give you some highlights, is that I had extensive taped interviews with Dr. Cyril Wecht, who just passed away last year. He was widely regarded and described as the godfather of forensic pathology. He had been involved in very, very famous cases, everything from being the first civilian to look at the autopsy results of the Kennedy autopsy, found a lot of trouble with that, by the way, and did think that there was a conspiracy to assassinate the president. He was involved with everything leading through the Natalie Wood death, the John Benet Ramsey, on and on and on. He knew Thomas Noguchi, and he revealed to me, Dr. Cyril Wecht did, that Noguchi had ordered a segmental analysis of Marilyn's intestines. Now, this is the way that pathologists would normally determine whether there had even been oral ingestion of a drug and over what period of time it had occurred. So the revelation here is that Noguchi didn't just send out her kidneys and other body organs to be analyzed, and none of them were except for her liver and her blood. All the rest of the samples, the forensic samples, were quickly destroyed. But Noguchi had also done the key thing, which was to order a segmental analysis of the intestines, which would have established once and for all, did she ingest that medication or was it otherwise administered to her? Now, Cyril Wecht had also commented on the fact that Marilyn had cyanosis, which is bluish discoloration of the skin. And he pointed out to me that that just wasn't likely to occur in the case of a drug-induced death that was induced by oral ingestion, because what cyanosis connoted was a quick death, which just did not happen typically when somebody popped pills. It would take a while for the pills to be metabolized and to really shut down the system. But Marilyn had the bluish discoloration that he suggested was more indicative of a quick death. So he never believed that it could have been determined with absolute 100% certainty that she hadn't been injected. He pointed out that a very fine needle could have been injected in her hair or someplace where it could have been easily overlooked. But I shared with him something that other authors have completely overlooked, and that is that Dr. Ralph Greenson, the psychiatrist, his daughter, I believe, unwittingly outed her father while trying to make him seem like he was a very good doctor for Marilyn, which he definitely was not. She said that sometimes her father would open up Marilyn's medication and pour some of it out clandestinely, so that Marilyn would think she was getting more of the drug than she really was. Now, that could only mean one thing. Marilyn's sleeping medication came in capsule form. So Ralph Greenson's daughter must mean that he opened up the capsules, poured out some of the contents, and then reassembled the capsules and put them back in the bottle. Otherwise, Marilyn would have noticed, obviously, that her pill bottle was, more empty. It didn't have as many capsules in it as it otherwise would. So what this really means is that we have now identified that Ralph Greenson is the #1 suspect for having tampered with Marilyn's medication and induced an overdose. Now, the other revelation I have in the book pertaining to this subject is that I found receipts showing that Marilyn was purchasing what are called fleet enemas. Now, I know there's been speculation over the years because of the anomaly of purplish discoloration of her colon, which suggests that that was caused by the acidic properties of a drug being introduced, like Nembutal. People have speculated, well, who did this? Did somebody come into her home and do this? Did Mrs. Murray do this to Marilyn? But they're thinking of the old-fashioned bag and hose enema, where you hang it on a doorknob and so forth. But that wasn't necessary. Marilyn was a frequent user of fleet enemas, and they consisted of a small opaque bottle of liquid with a nozzle on one end that was designed to be self-administered. I also determined from Dr. Hyman Engelberg's account that he had previously treated Marilyn a few days earlier for a case of diarrhea. Now, having been so treated, it is not uncommon for patients to have the pendulum swing in the other direction, too far in the other direction. Hence, they become constipated. Now, note the curiosity that Marilyn did not eat anything her last day alive. Why would that be? She just snacked on fruit juices, but ate no solid food. Well, the reason for that most likely was that she was constipated. She didn't want to add to her discomfort. So by the evening, she was ready to do a fleet enema. Now, she wouldn't have done that in her own bathroom off her bedroom because the water had been shut off there. And she wouldn't have done it in the bathroom that was across the hall between two bedrooms, because Mrs. Murray was there and Norman Jeffries was there. And let me digress for a moment. I find it just imponderable that other authors have not paid any attention to Norman Jeffries and his established presence in Marilyn's home on Saturday, August 4th. He avoided speaking out for years, but he was finally tracked down. And he indicated, he told a story, and I tell it in my book, his account of what was going on that day at Marilyn's house and after she died. Norman Jeffries was definitely there because Marilyn signed a payroll check. He was on her payroll. He was not just an occasional handyman. He was helping Marilyn get things in order for her house that she was in the process of remodeling and redecorating. He had been working on the kitchen floor, for example, that Saturday. So there's a check that proves that Marilyn had not only written him his payroll check, signed it on August 4th, she'd even issued another check to cover another 2 weeks when she would be gone, because she was getting ready to go to New York. And so she wanted to make sure that he had a check for that period. So Norman Jeffries was there, okay? Now, also proving that Norman Jeffries was at Marilyn's residence on Saturday is that she had anticipated the delivery of some landscaping materials to her home on Saturday. Indeed, they were delivered. Various fruit trees and so forth that she had purchased that week by visiting a local nursery. And on the receipt, the purchase receipt, Marilyn had given instructions that the people that delivered the nursery items should ask for Mr. Jeffries. So she anticipated he would be there that Saturday, and indeed he was. So keep that thought in mind. Okay, so we have Marilyn going to the guest cottage where there was a bathroom and a day bed where she could self-administer the fleet enema. And it would be very easy for Ralph Greenson during his late afternoon visit to her house to have spiked that enema. Marilyn would have remained unaware until she started to use it, after which she no doubt expelled it quickly because it was creating a burning sensation. So she did absorb some of it, but not enough necessarily to be fatal. And that's key also. Now, what's also further interesting, there's a lot of corroboration that Eunice Murray ended up in the guest cottage at one point because she took a phone call and was in the guest cottage and known to be in the guest cottage around 9 o'clock that night when she spoke with Mickey Rudin, Marilyn's attorney. But aside from that, the fleet enema is key to a lot of what happened here. And Marilyn still had enough cognition that she was able to make a phone call to Ralph Roberts' number. Ralph was the brother she never had. I have extensive quotes from him that are original to my book, by the way, exclusive to my book, and don't appear in any other book. And she had left no message, but the operator had noted that the woman who called Ralph had a bit of slurred speech. So I believe that Marilyn was suffering the effects of the medication, the sedation that had been induced by her unknowingly taking that drug when she took the fleet enema. Now, there's also substantial evidence that around 10 o'clock that night, Bobby Kennedy returned to the residence with a couple of people who were part of the Los Angeles Police Goon Squad. And I established in my book that Bobby Kennedy definitely knew these individuals. He also knew Lieutenant Hamilton, who was in charge of the intelligence division. And Hamilton had done favors for Bobby in the past. So Bobby Kennedy comes over. Now, when he had visited her home on that Saturday afternoon and had an angry confrontation with Marilyn, which I'll talk about in a minute, Bobby was a pit bull. He was not going to leave without what he came for. So he obviously arranged, and or Peter Lawford arranged, for Marilyn to be sedated so he could return with a couple of guys from the police department to search her house without interference. But as I reviewed with Dr. Cyril Wecht, the most likely scenario is that Marilyn was awake enough to protest when he returned around 10 o'clock, according to Norma Jeffries. And Fred Otash, remember, was surveilling the house. The FBI confirms Fred Otash, notorious wiretapper, was surveilling the house, had bugs installed in Marilyn's home. And years later, he admitted that when stories started to surface about a so-called reinvestigation of Marilyn's death, Otash finally admitted that he had heard the sound of Bobby Kennedy putting a pillow over Marilyn's face to stifle her screams. And then he quickly beat a retreat and hurried out of there. So in reviewing all this stuff with Cyril Wecht, he noted the bluish discoloration. He also admitted that it is very likely that smothering could have been overlooked. He said there probably isn't any pathologist in America who has ever not overlooked a case of smothering, because smothering is not readily apparent. Yes, it's suggested by bluish discoloration, but if there are no clear marks on the skin, the pathologist doesn't automatically think that, well, this patient might have been smothered. Now, note that there were bruises on Marilyn's back and her hip, which are suggestive of someone holding her down. And Noguchi was never able to explain that. In fact, he said it was a, quote, sign of violence. So that suggests to you that something happened to Marilyn. And I can go into detail. I have a lot of detail in the book, multiple chapters talking about the forensics that show that Marilyn most likely died of a spiked enema. In fact, Peter Lawford's wife, one of his last wives, said that when she asked him, how did Marilyn die? He said, well, she took her last big enema. So anyway, these are just little teasers. You need to dig into my book, The Real Marilyn Monroe, and I'll give you a very, very comprehensive accounting of, I believe, what happened. I think there was a convergence of people that wanted to end Marilyn by some means. That would include Ralph Greenson and Eunice Murray, who were fired by Marilyn that last day. It also includes Bobby Kennedy. And I go into detail, a lot of detail about other instances in which Bobby had played point man and had either bribed, coerced, threatened, or even deported women who posed a threat to his brother due to the womanizing. And I tell you of other examples. I also want to address this whole matter of the diary. Now, some have said Marilyn didn't have a diary. She wasn't organized enough to keep a diary. It's true that she wasn't necessarily organized enough to keep a daily diary, but I established without any doubt that she did own a diary. And the way I did that is I was able to find 3 newspaper articles that were published in Los Angeles newspapers earlier in 1962 that reported that Marilyn was observed writing notes in a diary as she talked with Robert Kennedy at a party which these reporters also attended at the home of Peter and Pat Kennedy Lawford. So without question, Marilyn had a diary and Bobby knew it. Now, it's been reported that columnist Dorothy Kilgallen had written a somewhat cryptic column on Friday, August 3rd, which hinted at a romance between Marilyn and a man that was even more important and more famous than Joe DiMaggio in his heyday. Since the Kennedys had already been publicly associated with Marilyn, people naturally would assume that it was one of the Kennedy brothers whom Marilyn was seeing and to whom Dorothy was alluding. It's also worth noting that she wasn't the only columnist. Earl Wilson on Thursday had similarly written about Marilyn's involvement. He said she went on a fabulous date with a very important man. So the word was already filtering out, and inquiring minds would want to know. So Bobby Kennedy interrupted his family vacation. He had been scheduled to visit California to make a speech anyway, and he had brought his wife and 4 of his children. There's photographs of him arriving at the San Francisco airport on Friday afternoon, and he went to the so-called ranch of a Mr. Bates, who was another Kennedy crony. Mr. Bates covered for him up and down the line. But anyway, we know that Bobby was in California the day Marilyn died. He obviously showed up at her home in the afternoon, and we know it was a surprise visit. And why did he do that? By surprise, he wanted to get the jump on her and intimidate her. And I have various accounts in my book about Bobby Kennedy's fierce temper, his arrogance. His own brother, Jack Kennedy, described him in unflattering terms. Bobby Kennedy went to Marilyn's house and tried to intimidate her into surrendering her diary and any other thing that would link her to Kennedy. Now, there's even, that story has been told to you somewhat by other authors, but here's more elaboration from my book, The Real Marilyn Monroe. And that is the fact that Debbie Reynolds, the actress, knew that Marilyn had been in touch with her hairdresser, Sidney Gilroth. And the reason is because Debbie Reynolds had contacted her friend, Sidney, and asked him to get in touch urgently with Marilyn. Now, why did Debbie Reynolds do that? Well, I report exclusively that the Reverend Billy Graham, the well-known evangelist who traveled the world on crusades, Christian crusades, and surely was a credible individual. Billy Graham, who was a friend of a series of American presidents, had attempted to reach Marilyn Monroe to warn her that she was in, quote, mortal danger, but he was unsuccessful in getting in touch with her. So he called up Debbie Reynolds late one night and said he wanted to get in touch with her. And she knew Marilyn, and Debbie's home phone number was in Marilyn's address book. But for some reason, Debbie decided the best person to get in touch with Marilyn and persuade her to talk to Reverend Graham would be Sidney Gerloff. And Gerloff did do that. He recounted that in later interviews. And I was able to befriend a man who, when he was a young hairdresser, became acquainted, a very good friend of Sidney Gerloff. He apprenticed apparently under Sidney. And so he was able to elaborate about what Sidney had privately shared and not publicly shared about his interaction with Marilyn that last day. Marilyn obviously became aware that Sidney was trying to get in touch with her. So after Bobby Kennedy had left her home that Saturday afternoon, she returned Sidney Gerloff's call. And he was reported as having said, I reported in my book, that Marilyn recounted to him that Bobby had come over unannounced and had terrorized her. She was absolutely terrified, he said, that physical harm could come to her and that he had manhandled her. And she was just out of her mind with terror. That also dovetails with what Norman Jeffries said. He said he'd never seen Marilyn in such a state. Remember, when Bobby came over to the house, Norman Jeffries and Eunice Murray were asked to leave the house. Peter Lawford gave them some money and told them to go get Cokes, and they did do that. When they came back, she was just in a hysterical state. She was not only very, very angry, but she was emotionally overwrought. That's why Eunice Murray called Dr. Greenson late in the afternoon. Anyway, Sidney proceeded to explain, of course, that he had talked twice to Marilyn. He had urged her to come to his home for safety, and to his everlasting regret, she did not do so. But he also had talked to her a second time after she had seen Greenson, and he said she had calmed down considerably at that point, but she had remarked cryptically, you know, I know a lot of secrets. Sidney asked her, what kind of secrets? And she said, dangerous ones. And that was the end of their conversation. Sidney Gerloff, in case you don't know, ended up being one of two pallbearers from Marilyn's inner circle, the other being Whitey Snyder, her makeup artist. That was quite a high honor because Joe DiMaggio, who organized the funeral, excluded anybody and everybody, basically from Hollywood, that was involved with Marilyn, but he kept Sidney Gerloff and Whitey Snyder, and that says something a lot about them. I also wanted to review some other things about Marilyn that people don't know. Another thing that's in my book exclusively is people say that Marilyn Monroe went to the Cal-Neva Lodge the weekend before her death. That is totally wrong, and I prove it's wrong in my book. She actually went 2 weeks before her death. That is affirmed by the hairdresser she took with her, whom nobody has ever interviewed, but I have quotes from him. He ended up being Nancy Reagan's hairdresser. I'm not going to give you his name right now, but you can look it up. He was Nancy Reagan's hairdresser. He was at the Cal-Neva Lodge with Marilyn 2 weeks before her death. I also established that by virtue of a letter that a reader of Life magazine wrote to that magazine, recounting how she had sat at a table adjacent to Marilyn and talked to her for the better part of an evening, quote unquote. And Marilyn was obviously in fine form to be able to carry on a conversation, contrary to the way some people have portrayed her. And that woman established that as having occurred 2 weeks to the day from when Marilyn died. There was also a contemporaneous report in Variety magazine that Marilyn was accompanying the Lawfords to Cal-Neva 2 weeks before her death. It has been said that Joe DiMaggio was with Marilyn, or at least overlooked the Cal-Neva Lodge and spied on her, but he couldn't have done it that final weekend before her death, because I proved something that other authors could easily have figured out if they'd done their homework. And that is that Joe DiMaggio was in New York playing in an old timers game. And it's on the front pages of newspaper sports pages all across America. So he was not even in that vicinity, but he had been 2 weeks earlier prior to Marilyn's death. Along these same lines of important facts to know is that Joe DiMaggio had become a part owner of the Cal-Neva Lodge. Now, nobody has come up with that. I'm the only author that I know of that's ever reported that. He became a so-called investor of the Cal-Neva Lodge in June of 1962. Now, he was a front for the mob, specifically Sam Giancana. I hate to tarnish the image of a guy that's so revered in sports history, but Joe DiMaggio was all mobbed up. I name names, and I tell you of his fraternization with mobsters over a period of years, and some of these stories are rather chilling. So and that fact, by the way, probably upset Marilyn, because contrary to what some authors like Anthony Summers have reported, Marilyn did not date mobsters. And I go into a lot of detail about that and prove why she didn't and why she wouldn't. But suffice it to say, she didn't. But Joe DiMaggio becoming a part investor of the Cal-Neva is intriguing because he was at that point feuding with Frank Sinatra, because Sinatra had been dating, off and on, casually dating Marilyn. Although he wasn't deeply involved with her, they were going out on dates periodically, and DiMaggio was insanely jealous. So there's more to that story. What I also go into detail on is that the other big investor behind the Cal-Neva Lodge was Joseph Kennedy, Sr., Joe Kennedy, old man Joe, the patriarch of the Kennedy family. He had had an involvement from years earlier in the Cal-Neva Lodge, and he had even used the Cal-Neva Lodge and equity in it as a bargaining chip to recruit Frank Sinatra to help him put his son over the top. He implored Frank Sinatra, and Tina Sinatra even confirmed this, to round up some of the Hollywood elite and get them to endorse his son, Jack Kennedy, for president in the 1960 campaign. And Joe Kennedy promised Sinatra that if he did that and he was successful, that Joe Kennedy would sell a portion of the lodge to Frank Sinatra and his investors, one of whom temporarily was Dean Martin, but Dean was smart enough to bail out of that deal. Sure enough, the same day that Jack Kennedy won the West Virginia primary, an item appears in the back of newspapers saying that Frank Sinatra had acquired part interest or ownership in the Cal-Neva Lodge. How extraordinary that is. Well, it turns out that the other partner being Sam Giancana, when Sinatra acquired the lodge, there was a very ambitious remodeling project undertaken, and they anticipated being able to borrow money from Jimmy Hoffa and the Teamsters Union. But Hoffa had a bone to pick with the Kennedys because Bobby Kennedy was trying to erase all markers, and his attorney general was going after the mob, not because he was concerned about organized crime, because the Kennedys were involved with members of organized crime. He was just trying to erase the traces of any links. So Hoffa turned down the request of Sinatra and Giancana to loan the money. What ended up happening is Sam Giancana had to dig deep into his pocket to come up with the money for the big remodeling project that was undertaken of the Cal-Neva Lodge. And he was incensed by this. And he felt that old Joe Kennedy and the Kennedy family should share in a lot of that expense. So he demanded a summit be held between a Kennedy representative. He wanted Bobby Kennedy to show up for a, quote, summit, unquote. This is verified by solid corroboration, including FBI surveillance, by the way. But Bobby Kennedy never did show up. However, Peter Lawford was deputized to represent the Kennedy family interests, and this is very, very well documented. He also even entertained Sam Giancana at the Lawford home in California when Pat Lawford was away. So Pat and Peter Lawford did go to Cal-Neva, and the reason they took Marilyn was to have a cover story. Pat Lawford at that point, 2 weeks before Marilyn's death, was out in Hyannisport. That's affirmed by press reports. Every summer she would spend about 6 weeks in Hyannisport. She and Peter had held a July 4th party that Marilyn went to. They tell you details about that. But after that, she flew to Hyannisport. And so she returned. This is quite extraordinary. She returned from Hyannisport, interrupted her visit there to come back and flew to the Cal-Neva Lodge in Nevada, on the Nevada-California border. And Peter Lawford accompanied Marilyn on Frank Sinatra's plane up to the Cal-Neva Lodge. So the Lawfords were there to have a summit, and Peter Lawford was going to try to iron out financial differences between the Kennedy family and the mob. But while Marilyn was there, Sam Giancana was able to take her aside with Sinatra's help and proposed that she cooperate in a blackmail scheme. He knew that she wasn't real happy about the Kennedys and the way they'd been treating her, though she was never going to go public with that. She had no history of vengefulness, was never going to ruin her career and her life by smearing the Kennedys publicly. But Giancana wanted her to help set up Bobby Kennedy for blackmail. They already had audio tapes of the Kennedy brothers with Marilyn, but what would be more compelling would be photographic evidence. And the scheme was that Marilyn would agree to be photographed, filmed with Bobby Kennedy in bed, and they would use that film as leverage to get the dogs called off of the mob, basically. And they suggested to Marilyn that she was in no danger because this film would never become public. The Kennedys would see to that. She could even pretend to be a victim of the mob, but she would have none of it. She was absolutely adamant that she was not going to cooperate in any regard with any efforts to blackmail the Kennedys, although clearly she did report that to Bobby Kennedy, and there's records of a phone call in which she did that. I'm going to wrap this up for today. I think I've covered a lot of ground rather randomly. I hope you followed along with it. There's much to discover in my book. It's not all about controversy. I have many, many warm-hearted anecdotes and funny anecdotes about Marilyn you've never heard before. For example, even her roommate, when she was rooming at a facility that young actresses would stay at in Hollywood, it was chaperoned and so forth, a studio sponsored facility. And that woman had never previously spoken out that anybody knew, but I have her in the book. Many, many other voices that you've never heard before are in my book, The Real Marilyn Monroe. I would point out that it's available worldwide on Amazon and Barnes & Noble. You can get the printed book, which is 768 pages, or an ebook. So I do hope that you'll be interested in pursuing this. It's unlike any other book. I tear down a mountain of lies about Marilyn and set the record straight. I hope you've enjoyed this chat, and I'll be with you again soon to talk more. Thanks for joining me.